Hello and welcome to this bonus episode of the Prospect Podcast. My name is Benjamin Clark and I'm joined today by James Bloodworth. James is the author of Lost Boys, which is a deep dive into the manosphere, and we've had a previous episode of the Prospect Podcast with my colleagues Ellen and Alona on that particular issue. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. But today I wanted to speak to James about his recent profile in Prospect magazine of Matthew Goodwin. So James, do you want to just explain to the audience, for people who don't know, who is Matthew Goodwin?
Thanks for having me, first of all. Matthew Goodwin, he's an academic who's essentially gone rogue in recent years. So he started out as a cerebral, intellectual foe of investigator of the far right, really. Investigator of the British National Party, UKIP, as it was at the time, and some of those radical right movements, who over the years has steadily come to kind of leave academia and become essentially a proselytizer for these same movements. So he's gone native, so to speak, among the movements he was initially researching.
Yeah, interesting. And so chart that journey a bit for us. So I guess in the beginning, he was not only looking into these groups in an academic sense, he also, I believe you mentioned in the piece, he was on a sort of government panel on multiculturalism or something of that regard. So he was obviously invested in a kind of more centre-right project, and over time he seems to have increasingly adopted some of the tactics that he has been investigating, and now is sort of gone full populist. So chart that journey a little bit for us in detail.
So Matthew Goodwin, he's always been kind of a working class, blue collar conservative, as it's sometimes called. He's always been kind of centre-right, but initially he was someone who was coming at his research from a place of we should really be worried about the white far right, not just, because in the 2000s and early 2010s, even with the ISIS attacks in France, for example, there was a big focus in the media and in terms of academic research and anti-terrorist research on Islamist terrorism, jihadi terrorism. But Matthew Goodwin was someone who was writing at the time in the early 2010s for newspapers like The Guardian, warning government ministers not to take their eye off the ball when it came to the white far right, the domestic far right and the threat of violence and terrorism that could come from those quarters. He was on a government panel later on anti-Muslim bigotry. He's also been on social mobility panels in the government. And he wrote two well-received books on looking at the British National Party initially. That was what he did his PhD on in university as a student. And then later on, he wrote a very well-respected book with another academic, Rob Ford, looking at kind of the rise of UKIP in 2013, the rise of the radical right and how Nigel Farage's kind of version of populism was catching on with some working class voters, but it was looking at it from a place of, whilst sympathising with some of the material concerns that had driven some working class voters towards a more extreme politics, it was very kind of, there were no illusions about the representatives of those politics, the kind of the vanguard who were kind of leading those right wing populist movements. There wasn't a sense that Goodwin was really sympathetic to those movements at the time, which obviously that was something that's changed in recent years.
Yeah, interesting. And so I guess talk to us about some of the rhetoric and some of the talking points that he hits upon now. He's been on GB News a lot, for instance, and writing in the press, for instance. What are some of his preoccupations now that he's gone further to the right?
Immigration, obviously, is the main preoccupation of Goodwin, but everything's written so he has a show on GB News. And he also has a Substack, a very popular Substack, and I think he makes quite a bit of money from that. But all of his content now is really inflammatory. Everything. It's always five seconds to midnight. Alarmist kind of rhetoric about the changing demographics of the UK. The idea that essentially that as Britain becomes more multicultural, as it becomes more a more mixed race society, obviously in places like London and the cities, that somehow constitutes a threat to Britain, a threat to kind of white British people. Essentially, it started off with legitimate concerns about immigration. He writes about this a lot, but it's become much more radioactive in recent times. So now he's talking about things like the number of white British people declining, and that in itself is something that we should feel threatened by. And also, talking about social housing in London, so making out that social housing is just filled with foreigners and conflating the idea that someone who's not born here but is a British citizen is somehow less entitled to using the welfare state than someone who is born here. So my girlfriend, for example, is Brazilian but is a British citizen. She has a British passport. So someone like Goodwin thinks that from the things he says that someone like that is essentially a second class citizen compared to me, which I think that's quite a dangerous path to go down, and it's also not how British citizenship works. It's that is actually, he claims to be a proponent of British values, but that actually goes against the way we have tended to see citizenship in Britain.
I'm interested in his relationship to Reform UK. So you mentioned that he has a show on GB News. He's engaged with Nigel Farage on many topics, and you mentioned in the piece the possibility that some have speculated that he may be further involved with Reform going forward. So if you could speak to, I guess, his relationship with that party.
Yeah, so Goodwin's essentially become a propagandist for Reform UK. I see Goodwin nowadays. I mean, we can talk about like psychological reasons for why he may have moved to the right, and I explore some of that in my piece. So people who knew him have talked about his personality being brittle, him being someone who's always like sought admiration and a media profile, and someone who was quite insecure. He's someone who kind of remembers any slight that's ever been made against him. He remembers all of it. It's like someone who doesn't forget any of that stuff and then bears the grudge for the rest of his life. It seems to me he's that kind of person. But he's also a political entrepreneur. Someone who, this is very transparent when I began to look at his Substack. He's someone who is very transparently motivated by clicks and cash. So he's cultivated this audience on Substack, and something called audience capture has happened to some extent, I think, where he's cultivated this audience. He sees that these inflammatory headlines about immigration are the pieces that tend to bring in the big numbers on the Substack and bring in the subscriptions. And he's leaning into that. So he's very much fanning those flames, as it were, because that's become a business model for him. So, I mean, we can talk about, the motivations for this, whether it's psychological or whether it's purely for profit. But I think with that stuff, when you lean into that stuff long enough, I mean, when you look into the abyss long enough, it's a distinction without a difference. I think after a while, he's someone who that kind of radicalization has, I think whatever the reason for it is, like he really believes that stuff now. And I think with Reform, he as a political entrepreneur, he sees the way the wind is blowing politically. He sees that kind of the radical right is where the energy is on the right at the moment. I think we've had 14 years of Conservative rule. The Conservatives ran out of ideas. Like, what is the Conservative Party for now? Is it just for more privatisation? I mean, that kind of doesn't really, there's, I think, there's a crisis on the left. There has been for a long time since the fall of the Berlin Wall, since the fall of the collapse of kind of post-war social democracy. And the left is still kind of working through that, especially after the collapse of the third way under Tony Blair as well. But conservatism is also going through a crisis now as well, where, what is the Conservative Party for post Margaret Thatcher? It can't just be more privatisations, because you kind of run out of things to privatise. So the energy, I think, on the right is on the radical right, and people like Goodwin, who are, as I say, political entrepreneurs, are trying to ingratiate themselves with the people they believe are going to be in power in 4 years' time. And that means, Goodwin did an interview with Michael Gove for The Spectator, where Michael Gove almost in jest seems to suggest to him, would you perhaps consider being a Reform Home Secretary in a Reform government? And Goodwin takes it completely seriously and chuckles along and basically says, yes, he would. He would very much like to do that. So that's kind of, he's always someone who's wanted to go into politics, I think, and that was something that some of his former academic colleagues told me as well. So I mean, he's very much trying to ingratiate himself with Farage and that whole Reform movement at this moment in time.
Yeah, interesting. Something that I struck on in your answer there is, I guess, this central tension, I think, around someone like Goodwin, which is to what extent is he, a unique individual, in which case we might say, oh, well, look, just ignore some of the inflammatory things that he says and don't give him more oxygen, etc. But but to what extent is he symptomatic of some broader trends that we see on the right and in the media generally? I guess, you spoke to some of the structural incentives there being sort of captured by your audience and going further and further into the things that they're seen to want and to click on and to monetize.
I think Goodwin is essentially surfing a wave in terms of where the kind of energy is on the right at the moment. So you see that among the commentariat. I think you see certain shifts in the information landscape. So most notably Elon Musk's purchase of Twitter and turning it into X in 2022. I think that's really taken the lid off in terms of radicalization on the right. So I think the fact that, something similar happened to an extent with the left in the 2010s, but not to the same extreme, I wouldn't say. So I think Twitter for a while was a place where if you're on the left, you could kind of get drawn into this world of quite narcissistic kind of hyper-identity politics where you could just easily, as someone on the left myself, you could easily just be denounced for some kind of trivial kind of faux pas or something and just kind of hung out to dry by sections of the commentariat on there. And it created this impression among some of those people that the political landscape in the UK and America particularly was more left-wing than it actually was. And I think something much more extreme has happened on the right since Elon Musk's purchase of Twitter, where you have people feeling more uninhibited on the right in terms of, you just see, let's be frank, you just see kind of open racism now from some, I think, people writing for some websites like Unheard, GB News. You see some of these people just kind of saying, to my mind, openly racist things, talking about mass deportations of what are British, essentially, like what are British citizens, and complete apologetics for the violent disorder last year, the racist rioting, and I think if you see some of these people, their idea of what the public mood is, they take from Twitter, and they feel more comfortable. It's not necessarily radicalization. Some of it is, but it's also they believed these things before, but now they feel more confident in kind of espousing them. And I think some of that's, I think that's the case with Goodwin. And I think that's where the cash and the clicks are on places like X now. You've seen a bunch of people bunch of liberals decamp to Blue Sky and kind of left the field open for some of these darker tendencies. And I think that the more that stuff is kind of, they like with each kind of thing they put out, people like Goodwin, they feel more emboldened, so they'll push the envelope a little bit more each time. They'll go on GB News following the riots and say, this isn't about racism. This is just about legitimate concerns. Meanwhile, mosques are having bricks thrown at them. You had a black guy in Manchester I think it was Manchester or Blackpool, being dragged out of a car and kicked and told to get out and go home. You have kind of ethnic minority people being attacked, and yet you have this whole ecosystem now which says, oh no, it's just like people expressing their legitimate anger about immigration, and they do that and they get away with it and they get platformed on a television channel, and they feel more emboldened by that. And I think the envelope just gets pushed a bit more each time. And you see that with politicians like Robert Jenrick as well, who were, a somewhat mainstream, at least, conservative politician before, who's now kind of helping to fan the flames of this stuff because on X, that's kind of, he gets a bunch of people cheering him on when he does that.
Yeah, interesting. I guess a similar sort of figure to Matthew Goodwin, who you've also profiled for Prospect previously, is Douglas Murray, someone who is a conservative intellectual, is interested in ideas and was at least respectable, I guess, in terms of, the image that he was trying to put across of himself, say 5 or 10 years ago, but has increasingly moved rightward as well. Would you like to speak to Douglas Murray and maybe some of the similarities, or if there are any differences between himself and Goodwin?
Yeah, so Douglas Murray's a more interesting figure in some ways. He's a better speaker, I think a better writer as well. There's a bit more. I wouldn't say loads more, but there's a bit more depth to him as an intellectual, so to speak. But I think that there are similarities with Matthew Goodwin in the sense that I'm not sure how much of this is radicalization on the part of these people, because if you go back through the histories of some of these people, there are always hints of something darker. There are always hints of this more racialized politics, if you like. So, back in 2009 or 2010, Douglas Murray was someone who I saw at the time on television, and I think he may have written something in Standpoint magazine, which is since defunct, saying essentially that the English Defence League was just kind of what you'd want a protest against Islamic extremism to look like. And at the time I'd been to a counter demonstration against the EDL in Nottingham, and that isn't what you'd want a response to Islamism to look like. This was people who were kind of, when they weren't being hemmed in by police, they were rampaging through like Muslim neighborhoods, trying to sow fear and intimidation. Later on, Douglas Murray had written about how, walking around London, he seemed to have a problem with the fact that there weren't so many. He was seeing too many non-white faces. I mean, he openly said this, he gave a speech in the Netherlands to commemorate, I think it was Pim Fortuyn Memorial, where he gave a very, very radioactive speech about essentially Europe's problem is too much Islam. I think there's always been that with Douglas Murray. And I think he's someone who, because the political climate has shifted to the right, because that kind of mainstream, the bottom has fallen out of mainstream conservatism, he's simply drifting along with the crowd on that stuff, and just feels more able to say what he really thinks. I mean, there's an anecdote I have about Matthew Goodwin as well, where, of all people, I mean, I was at a Labourlist event, the Labourlist blog in 2014 or 15, I think it was 2014, and I had a few drinks and got chatting to Len McCluskey, just as you do at these kind of things. He was one of the Unite was one of the donors at the time. And we got into a conversation about UKIP, and then the book about UKIP by Rob Ford and Matthew Goodwin. And Len McCluskey said to me, he was, not someone, I have many criticisms of him, but he said, you want to keep an eye on Matthew Goodwin. I don't trust him. I feel like he's someone who's carrying water for UKIP. And at the time, this was, I didn't think that, and none of the people I kind of associated with politically would have necessarily thought that. And he was like, oh, you should watch him, because I mean, looking at his stuff, reading his stuff closely, I think he's someone who sympathizes more than he lets on with some of this stuff. And in hindsight, that's incredibly perceptive, I think. I mean, for all, I don't want to go into I don't want to praise Len McCluskey necessarily. Have had many disagreements with him. I think that's quite perceptive. So I think there's always been something with some of these people, a more radical kind of current beneath the surface, but I think they just feel more confident in expressing it now, and it's amplified by the kind of the waters they swim in on social media, where if you're on X, I've tweeted about Israel-Palestine recently, not my opinion, but just like a news story about like starvation in Gaza, and you just get kind of in the comments can just be like just completely open racism, and nothing is done about that anymore. And when people are doing that, I think they very quickly feel emboldened to just kind of become more unfiltered what they really think. And I think that applies also to people like Douglas Murray and Matthew Goodwin.
Yeah, I guess while you were speaking then, I was just struck by the similarities to, say, J.D. Vance, who was this figure who was almost treated as the sort of translator or explainer to liberal America of, Appalachia and some of the problems that are encountered there. But then increasingly over time, it slowly goes from describing these problems in a way that might seem critical or to have some sort of distance from, some of the things that he's saying. But then over time, increasingly is sympathizing with some of the worst instincts that he's identifying with. And then we see him now, full Trumpian in the Trump administration. So, I guess, it's not just a British phenomenon that we're seeing of these figures who move across.
No, and you could also cite Marco Rubio as kind of a figure who there comes a point, you don't really know whether they believe all of this stuff they're kind of carrying water for. But then you reach a point where does it really matter? Or, and maybe they persuade themselves, maybe they rationalize those things for career advancement. It's like, I see someone like J.D. Vance and Rubio as essentially political entrepreneurs. So J.D. Vance, he first appeared on the scene as a kind of blue collar whisperer or something, presenting poverty among kind of the people, like white working class people in America, his own background as the result of kind of cultural pathologies, And this message, is very amenable to wealthy white liberals, but also wealthy Republicans as well. It's essentially their own fault because of the culture. It's nothing to do with material inequality. But yeah, but he also was someone who was very critical of Trump and compared him to, I think it was Hitler, to a college roommate. But yeah, over the years he's kind of to my mind, he's seen where the wind is blowing, the way the wind is blowing, and as a political entrepreneur, it's made sense for him to kind of gravitate into that space and kind of put his previous misgivings to one side.
There's a lot to unpack here, I guess, with these figures, but we could go on all day. But we'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Thanks for having me on.
For the audience, I'll put the link to James's piece on Matthew Goodwin and his piece on Douglas Murray into the show notes of the episode, so you can give it a read. Thanks very much.
This interview was from an episode of the Prospect podcast. To read more of Prospect's award-winning journalism, head to prospectmagazine.co.uk.